In 1719, a ship named La Mutine, which means the mutinous women in French, sailed from France and was bound for the Mississippi. It was loaded with urgently needed goods for the French colony, but its most important commodity was a new kind of export, women. These were 132 women, most of them falsely accused of sex crimes, and they were prisoners shackled in the ship's hold. If these women are known at all today, they're thought as being exclusively prostitutes, but according to one historian, there's no evidence to believe that. Some were nobility, some were illiterate laborers, one was a fashion designer, another was a street vendor falsely accused of murder, but all carved out fascinating lives for themselves in the New World, becoming such things as property owners, traders with Indian tribes, or even world travelers. Today's guest is Joan Dejean, author of the new book Mutinous Women: How French Convicts Became Founding Mothers of the Gulf Coast. She looks at the stories of these women who carved out a place for themselves in the colonies that would have been impossible in France. Many were instrumental in the building of New Orleans and in the European settling of Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas, Illinois, and Mississippi. The story of America's founding isn't just about the Mayflower or about immigrants who came through Ellis Island, but many people came from many different directions, sometimes with very different backgrounds, and this is one of those stories. I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Joan Dejean. Joan, welcome to the show.
Hi, Scott. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to introduce these women to your audience.
There is a lot to talk about here, and perhaps one way for the work of a historian, sometimes it's serendipity how we discover different people. How did you first learn about these female prisoners in the archives?
Well, Scott, that's a strange story. One day I was working in the National Archives in Paris, and the National Archives in Paris closed at 4 p.m. And I came across a document that mentioned sending a woman to Louisiana. And in 1718, that meant only one thing, but it was very strange to talk about a prison file sending a woman to Louisiana. So I dug around and I found a reference to a document that spoke about this woman. But the call number was incomprehensible. So I didn't know what to do. The archives closed. I walked out into the street, and the chances of this are 1 in 10 million. The former director of the archive where the prison files are kept for the prisoners of Paris in the 18th century happened to be riding his bicycle down the street at that moment. I saw him, I waved to him, and I said, "Can I ask you a question?" And I showed him what I had written down. And I said, "Do you have any idea what this is?" And he said, "Yes, if you displace the period and do this, it's a reference to the Bastille archives, the prisoners, dossiers of prisoners." So the archives of the Bastille close at 5 p.m. And it's about a 20-minute fast walk. I raced over there. And when I opened that file, there was the beginning of all of this. So total chance. If he hadn't been riding his bicycle by, I probably wouldn't have followed up.
That's amazing. I mean, it really, people can think of archives as large dispersonal databases, but it's really the node of about 2 or 3 different archivists that if you have a personal relationship or you know someone, it's amazing the doors that can open.
Absolutely. Also, it's knowing different archives and the relation among the different archives and just being willing to dig once you have something, because in this case, things clicked at various moments, and I was lucky enough to find things. But it was just that interaction between different archives that managed it for me.
Well, before we get into the story of La Mutine arriving in 1719 in the New Orleans colony, I've looked at colonial history from many different angles on this podcast, the Spanish colonies, the English colonies, different colonies in the New World. Could you describe the state of the New Orleans colony before the ship arrived?
Okay, so New Orleans, there are different aspects here. There is the whole mass of what the French had taken over or were trying to take over on the North American continent, the lower part of the North American continent, not dealing with New France, Canada. And there are lots of different outposts along the Gulf Coast at that point. Mobile, now in the state of Alabama, was relatively advanced at that point. Other places like Biloxi, now in the state of Mississippi, were moving along. Other places now in the state of Louisiana or in Arkansas, Illinois, also were in different stages of advancement. New Orleans itself, what we now think of as the major city in all of this, was non-existent at that moment. A site had been chosen. People were not even sure to become a new capital for the colony. People were not even sure that it was the best site. They were discussing moving it. The land had barely begun to be cleared at the moment when their ship landed. Some of them actually moved to the place, we know of it as New Orleans, before its status at the capital, as a capital, was fixed. So they're among the first people. They were clearing land in New Orleans with their own hands.
I'm also curious about the program of the French government sending female prisoners to the colonies. Now, on one hand, this has the appearance of many time-honored practices of empires in which you send prisoners or quote-unquote undesirables out of the homeland and into colonies so that you can fill it and make it more difficult to conquer from other empires or nations or those who are already inhabiting those lands. But also, I don't want to assume, because any nation or empire, of course, has its own priorities when they set up programs like this. So what were the goals of the French government in doing such things as sending this ship of female prisoners to the New World?
It's hard to answer that question, Scott. If I had ever found clear goals, I'd have an easier time of this. It was completely haphazard. Men had been sent, deserters from the army, etc., had been arrested and sent prior to this, but not for long. In the case of the women, no one ever specified what they were up to, whether they were sending them as wives, etc. They discussed briefly whether when they got to the colony, they would be free or whether they would still be prisoners. Finally, it was decided they would be freed once they got to the colony. Whereas other countries, England, for example, sent prisoners and sent them as indentured servants. So they worked for a certain amount of time. There was a contract. It was clear. The women were sent with absolutely no terms to it and no guarantees. It would never have happened I don't think it ever would have happened. It certainly would not have happened this way, and it not happened just when it did in 1719.
There's an interesting phrase that appears in your book, wrongfully accused. And it could be easy for somebody to read that phrase and somehow imagine that there's a agent of the French government who wants to round up as many women as possible to send to the New World. But then I think that's probably imputing motive when there may be no evidence whatsoever. And as you said, things are happening in a much more happenstantious way. But why do you think this phrase and this of women being wrongfully accused of crimes ending up on La Mutine, this circumstance keeps happening?
Well, I'm convinced that at a certain point in 1719, precisely the summer of 1719, they were rounding up women to be sent to Louisiana. They had decided to go on with this. They weren't convinced they had enough women, and they were arresting women so quickly that summer. I compared arrest records in Paris 2 years before and 1 year later during the summer months. The number of women arrested, how fast. The main thing that was different in 1719, well, there were several things. More women were arrested, many more, and the time they were held between arrest and sentencing was reduced to almost nothing. So this meant their files were not being examined. They weren't given a chance to prove they had been somewhere else. Many people are arrested and have an alibi and are released immediately. These women were being arrested, and due process was being forsaken completely at that moment.
What do you make of that? Do you think that the government heard reports of a severe, let's say, gender imbalance in the colony and they wanted to remedy this, or something else?
I'm sure that they knew that before. It's hard to know exactly what was going on. The government in 1719, and in this case, the part of the government that controls what was going on with the colony, which is the Indies Company and a certain minister, was all in the control of this one man, John Law, a Scottish financier. And Law wanted very quickly a certain number of colonists, male and female, etc. He had guidelines. he was given precise figures of the numbers of people he was to send to the colony. So the women were part of that desire to collect colonists very quickly.
I want to get into the individual stories because this is where it gets very fascinating. There are people whose backgrounds you would never expect to be part of this group. But first of all, the voyage itself, many die. What happens on the voyage over, and why is this typical of the danger of the time for this type of voyage and this type of vessel, or was there something that went wrong during this voyage?
I think that as you know well, all voyages at this time are dangerous. The women did not travel in any kind of standard conditions, and even under standard conditions, people died during voyages. The women were brought to the New World in a ship, La Mutine, which was a slave ship, outfitted as a slave ship. So they were in chains in the hold of the ship. That could not have increased their chances for survival. In addition, they were barely fed, either before or during, etc. So these were not French. The French were notorious at that moment for not sending sufficient provisions on Indies Company ships. But people who went as passengers paying their own way were told about this in advance, and there are accounts of those people rushing out to buy provisions. People who traveled on their own and paid for their own passage also brought their food on board. So they were self-sufficient, or more or less self-sufficient during the voyage. These women arrived with nothing. So they had no choice. So all of this would lead to a higher death toll. Now, we can't be sure of the death toll for two reasons. First of all, the manifest of the ship, the list of passengers at departure, was so poorly drawn up. There are two different manifests, and they don't agree. So I can't be sure how many women were on board, who exactly the women were. Secondly, when they get to the colony, someone reported that all the women had survived. So this is, what can you do with something like that? I know that this is not true because when they got to the colony, they were first placed on an island off the coast called Ship Island. And while they're on Ship Island, one of the women, of course, they knew about how many people were on Ship Island. And one of the women later marries one of the first major historians of the colony, a man named Dumont de Montigny. And Dumont, in his history, gave the total of women on Ship Island. So from that, and the number he gives is approximately the number whose fates I have been able to determine in the New World, for whom I found records somewhere in the colony. So of a continuing life in the colony. I keep hoping, by the way, that some descendant will come forward and say, oh, yes, my ancestors survived too, because the record keeping was so poor initially that I can't be sure. But it's pretty clear that there was a horrendous death toll. You're right.
I'm curious if any sort of character profile emerges as you looked at these women, but perhaps we can look at individual profiles. One that I thought was very interesting we could start with was Manon Fontaine. Could you describe her?
Okay. I would totally agree with you. I thought a lot about profiles. Manon Fontaine fits the profile of a survivor. I thought very much about the kinds of women who likely survived and what they had in common. Manon Fontaine was an assertive personality. She was wrongfully arrested, absolutely, twice in Paris, very early in 1700 and 1701. She was arrested and charged with murder because of, people had claimed they had seen her in the street at the moment a crime was committed. She was elsewhere and could prove it. When she was confronted during her trial with the witnesses who alleged to have seen her, they admitted they'd never seen her before. So she was it was an accident that she was charged. And she was nonetheless, she protested these false arrests. And because of this, they were after her in the system. So women who protested their unjust treatment in the French legal system, penal system in general, tended to receive harsher sentences. They also tended to survive. So the women who were feisty enough to dare, I cannot conceive of the courage it took for a young woman, in Paris, poor woman, to protest and say, these officers of the law have unjustly accused me and arrested me, and my treatment is unjust. If they had the courage to do that, they tended to have what it took to survive everything during this voyage and to make lives for themselves in the New World. Manon Fontaine, by the way, was an illiterate street vendor. She sold day-old fruit in the streets of Paris that she carried around in a basket all day long. She ended up on the ship. She arrives in New Orleans, and she later helps build New Orleans. She dug up, in the end of her life, she owned 4.5 lots in what is today the French Quarter of New Orleans. That's a pretty amazing life, to go from a literate street vendor, wrongfully accused in 2 murder trials, and then shipped off and become a model citizen in New Orleans.
That was a point, without jumping ahead, what I see here are the qualities that could make someone fit in poorly in a heavily regimented, still very heavily class-based society, only a few centuries away from a medieval order before the French Revolution. Someone who couldn't fit well within a hierarchical system would also have the exact same qualities to do well on the frontier. And perhaps in some ways, prison could be the best education system for that, where you don't have a legal system to support you. You really have to survive by your wits, charisma, building alliances with other people in a situation that's fluid and constantly changing. Did you see that at all as you see these profiles of different figures?
Absolutely, Scott. What's interesting about what you're saying, too, and I agree with you totally, it's a great question, tough question, as you yourself know. What I saw through all of them was that their status in France didn't matter. For example, one of the women deported was from really the high aristocracy. She was so noble that her full family name, which none of the police managed to learn because it was so complicated, the DE2 is a sign of nobility in France. She had 3 of them in her name because her family owned so many estates, had such long roots, deep roots in the nobility. And Marie-Françoise Le Coustelier de Jouy de Palissy, to give her full name, saw that in this system in France, she was not going to have a really great life. Her family, she was a child of the 3rd marriage of her father. Everything in the estate was going to the 2 sons of the 1st marriage. A girl from way down the line was going to be a pauper. She ran away from home one day, and she managed to make it to Paris. It's an extraordinary tale of selling her clothes so she'd have enough money to travel to Paris. Of course, her family had her arrested, and the sons from the 1st marriage considered this the most shocking thing that could have happened to the family. And they had her arrested and imprisoned, and she ends up in the wild, in Arkansas. This was a part of the colony that was really never heavily developed. She saw things that no one else would have seen. New Orleans was safe, tame, settled territory next to Arkansas. So to go from this high aristocracy and life in a chateau to Arkansas is a pretty amazing life saga. And it was because she stood up for herself, and she decided she was going to try to make a life for herself. And it was that kind of self-assertiveness that I saw again and again in the women who had the strongest profiles in the story. You also mentioned relations, bonds, and I agree with that totally. I tried to track friendships among the women, and they were absolutely there. One of my favorite moments arrives very late in the story. The women have been in the colony for decades. 2 of them remain so close that communication, by the way, between these various French, not even cities, but outposts, was very difficult. But 2 of them remain so close that when one of them has a child, she wants another of them to come and be godmother to that child. And the woman travels. She would have traveled in a canoe, a dugout canoe, a pirogue, for days to get there to be godmother at the baptism of a woman she had known during this crossing. It was those kind of bonds. They must have protected each other and cared for each other during all this in any way possible.
The background that you provided of Marie-Françoise, she sounds very similar to an explorer in the Age of Discovery, or some of the Crusaders who are second sons or third sons. And you mentioned she was I think the youngest child of her father's third marriage. So she's part of this aristocratic system, but she stands to benefit very little from it. So, I mean, in some sense, she doesn't have much to lose by going on this adventure.
Right. She didn't choose, by the way. The adventure she chose was pretty amazing. She runs away. Her mother left home for a couple of days to deal with business concerns. She slipped out of the chateau in the afternoon, slipped away to the nearest market town, stood in the market and sold some of her clothing, which was worth a lot since the textile in aristocratic dress was very expensive, took that money, made her way, who knows how, to the nearest town with a boat connection, a river connection to the Seine and to Paris. And they would send logs to Paris. This was a well-known phenomenon in the 18th century. They would make them into what they call trains of logs, cut down trees, make the logs, ship them in. She hopped on top of the logs and sailed into Paris that way. So she chose a different kind of water adventure. She was then imprisoned for a couple of years, and then they grabbed her and sent her. So I agree with you. It's the same kind of mentality. She didn't choose it to go to cross the ocean, but she probably was fine with it. And once she got, by the way, when she got to the colony, she was in Mobile, now Alabama, and she managed to meet, it's just, I love the story, another son, in this case, a second marriage rather than a third, but a son of the nobility who was not going to get anything. His son, the father's son from an earlier marriage, was going to inherit the estate. So he took off and went there. And the two of them end up, these later marriages of noble families, end up in Arkansas together.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. There's another figure, Jeanne Maheu, who's interesting. First of all, because her crime seems so insignificant to do something as severe as send her across the Atlantic. But second of all, she is a part of a much wider trend that's happening with French trade beginning to dominate in the 18th century, particularly with luxury goods of conspicuous consumption that are appearing in wealthy houses across the Mediterranean and the Ottoman Empire. And while the 18th century many see as a story of British manufacturing and the growth of the triangle trade, France's role in international trade is growing substantially as well. And she, in a way, is a part of this in introducing this type of high culture and conspicuous consumption to the colonies. Can you tell me about her story?
That's I think Jeanne Maheu would have loved your description, Scott. So thank you for that. If I could speak for Jeanne, I will say this. One of the things that my principal motivation in doing this book was the sense of the descendants, thinking that these women, surely at first I didn't know how many descendants they had, but thinking to myself, these women surely have descendants, and they've been told what was on the first person in their family to arrive here, the first woman, was a prostitute, because that's what's on the files of most of these women when they leave Paris. So I kept saying to myself, don't they deserve to know that their ancestor was not a prostitute? Jeanne Maheu, over time, descendants have been in touch with me. My guess is that Jeanne Maheu has more descendants than anyone else. And her descendants tend to be really far-flung. I know descendants of Jeanne Maheu in Texas. I've been in touch with others in New York State, in New Jersey, etc. So they're all over. Jeanne Maheu was such an interesting figure. Had she stayed in Paris and done what people expected of her, she would have participated exactly in what you're talking about, in that development of the French luxury goods industry in Paris. She was in training. She was an apprentice to become a seamstress, a couturière, and they were very important. It was a guild that was in the hands of women. Women could become guild members and have the protection of a guild if they were couturière. And she was in training for this. What happened to Jeanne could have happened to anyone. It happened to men all the time. She was an apprentice to someone who did not run a good workshop. There were abusive conditions, and male apprentices frequently complained that the workshop, the head of the workshop, was being cruel to them. They would break the contracts. They would sign with someone else and start over again. Jeanne didn't like it. She quit. Her sister and brother-in-law in Paris had paid the small sum necessary for her apprenticeship, and they went crazy. And they declared her a libertine and a danger, and they went to the police about her. So you're absolutely right, because she had the courage to say, these are not proper working conditions, and I deserve better. She ends up in the colony. And when she has an incredible life, Jean. She's at first in Mobile, then in the Fort Toulouse, which is the French outpost nearest the eastern colonies in the Carolinas. So very, very north now in the state of Alabama, a considerable distance from anywhere. But she managed to get in her home there in this really remote area. It required weeks of river travel from Mobile to get there. She had textiles, French textiles, beautiful ones, multicolored, all kinds of patterns. Her husband dressed in the style just as fully stylishly as any man in Paris. She had lovely furniture of models. Absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Once again, the kinds of models of French furniture that the French are sending around and are becoming known as highly desirable items for the home. She had kitchen equipment to die for. So she managed somehow to recreate in what must have been, once again, one of the more remote areas of this vast colony, a life really up to Parisian standards. I would have given anything to have one glimpse of the actual insides of her home.
Right. I mean, it's amazing the skill and craftsmanship that are brought to the colonies at this time period. Another factor, too, of colonial life is that, as far as I understand from this period in Europe in the early modern periods, that while there is more social mobility than in earlier centuries, moving up the social ladder significantly can be a multi-decade, if not a multi-generational effort. However, one of the attractive features of the colonies is that if you're on one of the lowest rungs of your society's social ladder, you can climb much more quickly than you could back at home, because there's so much fluidity in the frontier that rigid hierarchies simply don't make sense there. And the example earlier that you gave of Marie Francois, who essentially lives as an outpost, and her husband are traders with the Chickasaw Nation. Someone who seems to do quite well for herself as Marie Baron and her husband, and even returns to France. I'm very interested in this. Can you tell me her story?
Okay, she's an extraordinary young woman. Marie Baron was an illiterate peasant girl. I mean, she was born in not even a village, in the countryside. Her father was so poor that when he died, and she was only 9 at the time, when her father died, the family didn't even have the very minimal, and it was really minimal money necessary for a church burial. So a charitable order paid for his funeral. Otherwise, he would have been buried in a pauper's grave. So this was a family that had suffered immensely. She ends up, as many children did, orphans. Her mother was already dead. She ended up in Paris, and there she found work as a laundress. Now, laundresses, I learned with this book, I'd never cared about laundresses particularly before, not paid attention to them. Laundresses were particularly vulnerable in the 18th century, and a number of the women who ended up in the colony worked as laundresses in Paris. When you worked as a laundress, you not only washed clothes, you picked them up and you delivered them. That meant that you went into the household, you collected the clothes. Women wore a large apron over their clothing at the period, working women, and you took a bundle of clothing, you tied it up in your apron, you carried it away, you cleaned it, you pressed it, you returned it to the house, and you put it there. Sometimes people even gave laundresses keys so that they could go in and do this. However, when anything was missing in the household, people always blamed the laundress, so that they were accused of stealing things. They kept saying, no, I didn't. But it's very difficult to get out of this when your accuser is from a high family. So Marie Baron ends up for a very different reason, however. One day she was with a fellow laundress. She was arrested like this earlier, One day when she's 16 years old, she and a fellow laundress do something so touching to me. They go look at ribbons in a ribbon shop. They were just looking at the ribbons. The owner of the shop decided that a ribbon was missing. He accused the two young women of having stolen it. They end up in prison. She had no one to defend her. She's illiterate. She's an orphan. She ended up being deported. When she gets to the colony, she first marries a farmer. They move to Natchez, which is one of the early settlements. They farm there. She happens to be in Natchez at the time of a Native American revolt against a very cruel and inept French commander, and the Natchez who tried to grab the sacred Natchez land. She is there. She watches her husband and her eldest son be killed during the uprising. She marries after this someone who was not at Natchez at the time, but who becomes, Dumont de Montigny becomes a great historian of the colony. And the account of Natchez in histories ever since has been in great part based on her eyewitness testimony of Natchez. So she therefore remarries. Her husband is the son of a prominent lawyer in Paris, so much above her station, her station in France, the second marriage. And then they at first have a farm. They later have a house in New Orleans. And then he gets sick. He says it. I'm sure she felt the same way. They do something theoretically impossible for her. They sail back to France. The women were legally not allowed to return to France, but they did it. They sailed to France. Her name does not appear on the manifest of the ship. She's the wife of Dumont. And once they get to France, she goes to visit her cousins, whatever's left of her family. They spend time there. They have two children. They've had two children already from the colony. And those children, the daughter marries in France, and the son becomes a naval officer and sails away. And before the end of her life, Marie Baron sails all over. She dies with her husband in India. So she traveled the world. And when she traveled, she and her husband were sitting at the captain's table. So can you imagine a life where you begin as an illiterate orphan, penniless, in a region of France that's really hard pressed with famines? You have two marriages across an ocean. You marry a man who becomes a prominent historian. You sail the world at the captain's table, all this in one lifetime.
She really had the great expectations treatment from getting sent to New Orleans.
Well, who knows what the head of a Marie Baron could have contained. She clearly, once again, Scott, was assertive. Her first arrest in Paris when she's very young, alibi. She had the courage to go to the police and say, and many people didn't even bother because the police rarely listened to you, and say, no, I wasn't there. I have an alibi. And she maintained this kind of thing. We know a story about her in Natchez. Someone was treating her unfairly, and she complained about it, and the case went to New Orleans to be adjudicated, and it was decided in her favor. So she was someone who never lacked the courage to go forward. And it was like her past didn't exist. She became the woman she wanted to become.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Another point you make that's interesting is that you argue the example of these women's role in history is entwined with the history of slavery. And I think that's a good point at this time period in the early 18th century, because although the arrival of African slaves in North America happens a century earlier, there's not the formalized system of slave codes and whatnot until many decades later, after lines harden between different racial groups and their status is formally separate from say, indentured servants into slaves, and the whole system of chattel slavery in the Virginia colonies. And you noted this at the beginning of our conversation, that these women arrived on a slave ship and their death toll numbers are horrendous, and they sound like what you would hear from a vessel as part of the slave trade. So could you describe more to me how you noticed the way that this story seems entwined with the history of slavery?
Okay, that's a huge question, Scott. As I'm sure you know, I'm going to try to tackle several small aspects of it. To begin with, the slave ship. The ship they were on, La Mutine, is a ship that was used before their crossing and after their crossing on numerous voyages, French voyages, in which it served as a slave ship. So it left Africa. Other trips took place to normally the Sugar Islands, the French Sugar Islands in the Caribbean, especially Saint-Domingue, which is today Haiti. I found a journal of the crossing of a 1704, one of the early crossings of the same ship as a slave ship. And so I have the exact death toll on that ship. It was horrendous. I make no attempt to say it wasn't horrendous. It was less than the death toll, less impressive than the death toll that I believe was the death toll in the women's crossing. So in other words, these were horrible voyages on a horrible ship with a horrible outcome for anyone. We know about the later crossings as well. So that's one intersection between the women's story and the history of slavery in French colony known as Louisiana. The other point that I think is very important is that their stories take place at the same time. At the moment when their ship landed in Louisiana, slavery, as you said, was well implanted in the Virginias and the English colonies. It was also well implanted in other French colonies. There were many enslaved Africans on the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean. But in the whole vast French territory on the North American continent, it's more or less equivalent to what will later be known as the Louisiana Territory. In all this territory, enslaved Africans had never been brought. There was no slave trade with Louisiana. There were a few enslaved Africans who were, for the most part, the property of the governor, Bienville, but no enslaved Africans. They were enslaved Native Americans, but chattel slavery did not yet exist. And the same movement in France, the same financial impetus to jumpstart this colony that took place in 1719, that impetus had the women deported to the colony. The same man who promised to send colonists also promised to send enslaved Africans. So for the first time, the French have a policy of the slave trade to the Louisiana colony. It's clear before that the French had not decided. There were many discussions about this, and every person with power over Louisiana, the colony of Louisiana, decides, no, we will not have the slave trade with Louisiana. This one man decides he wants to make Louisiana a highly successful colony. Sugarcane is not going to work there, he thinks, but he was a Scotsman, he knows about the English colonies and what's the source of their wealth at that time? Tobacco. So he tells everyone Louisiana will be a great producer of high quality tobacco, better tobacco than English tobacco. We will make so much money. We'll take over the market for tobacco, and Louisiana will be a huge moneymaker for France. So to do this, he knows that the English are using enslaved Africans in their colonies. So he decides, and he's given the permission, he's given control over the French slave trade, and he decides to detour ships. That's how the women ended up on a slave ship. He's able to control the use of the French slave ships. And he brings the first shiploads of enslaved Africans. The first shiploads of enslaved Africans arrived virtually at the same time as the women in the colony. So they were there. I can't even imagine, once again, what this would have been like. They were there in every settlement of the colony at the same time as the first enslaved Africans arrived in that settlement.
Lastly, to tie these things in together, I'm curious about the legacy of La Mutine and the women who were on board it. You had mentioned earlier that you were able to track down some descendants, which as you were describing that, I thought, oh, that's sort of a interesting parallel to New England blue bloods who would talk about family members who were on the Mayflower or part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, although a very different, interesting twist on it. But what do you see, both as a native Louisian and as a historian, the legacy of La Mutine and the women on it?
Okay, that's a complicated one once again. Thank you, Scott. First of all, I want to stress a point that isn't insignificant in my mind. The women, I didn't track down Descendants tracked me down. I don't know how people have managed to learn. I've gotten emails regularly over the past few years from someone saying, I hear you're working on this, and I don't know how it starts. I have even tried to, at one point, can you imagine, a descendant of Geneviève Betemont, who's one of the women deported at a very young age. Geneviève Betemont, who was at the time a college student herself, contacted me. She was in Paris. I tried to guide her through the French archives, but that's a little hard to do via email. You can imagine saying, okay, now you turn left, etc. Just doesn't work. But people have been in contact from all over, all walks of life, all ages, male, female. One person who contacted me was a retired school principal. She has numerous grandchildren, and she said she was preparing books for each grandchild about family history. And she'd heard I was working on this project, and what could I tell her? So all kinds of people with all kinds of different stories. The legacy is so different from the legacy of people, women in, say, you were a blue blood or anyone sent to an English colony. It's different in many ways, I think. First of all, it's different because for so many of the women, especially those who not only survived, but who had many descendants, there's so much more story. We know what happened to them in France. We know really how they ended up on this ship. And then we know their lives really in a fuller way in the colony. So there's a lot of story to them. And I think that's a very particular legacy, that in the case of about 10 of the women, descendants can really get to know what their lives were and who they were. You've asked questions. You made me smile many times because you mentioned so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. My favorites, I said to myself before, who will Scott be interested in? Will he be interested in any individual figures? And if so, which ones? Well, you've mentioned the people with extraordinary personalities. I feel, honestly, that I know Marie Baron. Now, what are the chances of getting to have a sense of the person of an illiterate peasant girl from France? It's just, they're almost nil, and yet it's possible with these women. I know Jeanne Mahou. I know Manon Fontaine. I can sort of figure what they might do in a situation. That's how they have extraordinary personalities. That's a legacy. That's a real legacy. Another extraordinary part of the legacy is what we've just been saying. They left so many descendants who also have such strong personalities that they're in touch. Someone wrote me at the beginning of this year, her husband is a descendant of Jeanne Mahou in particular, of Jeanne Mahou's first marriage in the colony. She is in touch with descendants from Jeanne Mahou's second marriage in the colony. And so they're clans of descendants from different marriages, and they're in touch. That's an extraordinary legacy. They've left a story that goes on, an incomplete story because people don't know really how they ended up on the ship, but they know that they were on that ship. So there's the sense of that ship, the women on that ship that has remained, even if people don't know what it means. And the last thing I'd say about the legacy is as I mentioned earlier, what's always been painful for me, the fact that it's known as a ship of prostitutes. In Louisiana, and now I'm not talking about the big colony, I'm thinking more specifically of a city like New Orleans, there's a certain affection for, how do I put it, behavior that might be shocking in other parts of the country, affection for non-blue bloods and unconventional behavior. So it's sort of something that's dealt with in an endearing manner. Oh, prostitutes. New Orleans has always had a history of brothels. Well, fine. In this case, though, they were not prostitutes. I found not a shred of evidence in any prison file of any woman arrested or deported, etc. I found not a shred of evidence that any of them were guilty of any kind of behavior we might consider prostitution. So, in fact, they were totally not prostitutes. They were guilty, as in the examples we've discussed, of behavior that was unconventional, yes, but unconventional in a way of female assertiveness rather than sexual deviancy. So I think that's an extraordinary legacy to be remembered fondly as prostitutes when you weren't prostitutes at all. It seems to me a very complex story, on the one hand, of a total misinformation, and on the other, this desire to keep their memory alive. And I think those are things that I found very endearing about the story and very maddening, because the fact that the prostitution legend clung to it drove me nuts, to put it bluntly.
Well, you've made a very good corrective here, and also showed that the settlement of the New World and the travels to it from Europe happened from many different directions. It wasn't just the Mayflower or people arriving, passing through Ellis Island in the early 20th centuries, but for many other places as well, and had many different stories. So I think this really adds a lot of more nuance and color to this multi-century journey of settlement that happened in the United States for many places. And there's much more to the story that we couldn't get into, but for listeners who want to look into it, the name of your book is Mutinous Women: How French Convicts Became Founding Mothers of the Gulf Coast. Joan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Scott. You were really kind. I appreciate all your questions.
All right, that is all for today's episode. If you'd like to see show notes for this and all my other episodes and include sources, maps, or other relevant information, go to parthenonpodcast.com. Parthenon is the name of the podcast network that History Unplugged is a part of, along with other great history shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History, Steve Guerra's Beyond the Big Screen and History of the Papacy, and other shows as well.